Can you feel it? There's electricity in the air. Welcome to our Emerging Issues webinar. Good day, everyone. My name is Andy Blanchard, and I lead our Emerging Issues team here at Verisk. Our presentation is titled An Electrifying Transition Inside the Insurance Implications of Electric Vehicles. And I have to tell you, beyond my work on emerging issues, I also lead our commercial auto coverage development team, and I know from where I sit there that our clients are reaching out to us quite a bit to talk about EVs. So I'm extra excited to bring this topic up to everyone today at our webinar. But as usual, I will begin with our policy statement. The policy of Verisk Analytics and subsidiary companies is to comply in all respects with federal and state antitrust laws. With this in mind, we want to mention that during all seminars held under our auspices, this policy prohibits discussion of certain topics. Because we want to avoid even the appearance of an antitrust violation, we go beyond the letter of the law and we will not discuss any matter that violates the spirit of the antitrust laws or can be perceived as doing so. A copy of our policy statement on discussion at meetings can be found at verisk.com/statement. And for today's agenda, actually, before we jump into the agenda slide, let me bring up Verisk attorney Ananya Barman. Ananya, good to have you with us on the call.
Thank you, Andy. Hello, everyone. As Andy mentioned, my name is Ananya Barman, and I am in-house counsel at Verisk. And just briefly, my role at these meetings is to ensure that we abide by the guidelines that are presented in our policy statement and discussion at meetings, which Andy previously mentioned can be found at the link displayed on the screen. It is our company policy to comply with all respects of federal and state antitrust laws and any other laws that may apply. So our policy statement restricts discussion of certain topics, as Andy mentioned, and these restrictions also apply to any questions or comments that are submitted through the chat feature, and of course, our presenters' responses to them. If you have any questions about what I just described or about a policy statement, please let us know during the course of this hour so we can address them. And with that, I'll turn it back to Andy. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Ananya. I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers. We've got a full agenda here, but first I wanted to mention to everyone, please bring on your questions. Only we at Verisk can see the questions that you pose using the chat function and go to webinar. I bet if you have a question, other people have that same question, so don't be shy. And if we don't get to your question during the live event, we nonetheless will respond to you afterwards. So our plan is to publish the written responses and the questions on our site. And next, we are recording today's event and expect to publish that as well. So, when you want to find these things, just scroll to the Emerging Issues website at core.verisk.com, and you'll see there's a section called Emerging Issues Webinars on Demand. And it'll all be there, the slides, the live event, and the Q&A. So for our presentation today, we're going to take a quick look at the EV market, the infrastructure before putting the EV risks under the microscope. Then we're going to take a little look out onto the horizon with advances in EV technology that's coming our way or likely to come our way. And following that, we are going to be taking a look at what our personal auto data is telling us. And finally, we'll focus on specific personal auto and commercial auto coverage and exposure considerations for EVs. I can see our green room is brimming with Verisk talent here, ready to grab the mic. So let me introduce the first of our many subject matter experts, Greg Scopletti.
All right, thanks, Andy, and thank you everyone for joining. So what I'm going to do is start by establishing what the market for electric vehicles looks like today, how it might evolve into the future, then take a look at some of the emerging risks that we see associated with these vehicles. But not just the vehicles themselves. So without being overly dramatic, I do think it's fair to say that this is a transition that could potentially represent a very profound shift with sweeping consequences, impacting not just our vehicle fleets, but possibly also our infrastructure, our energy grids, our health, our environment, our supply chains, our domestic manufacturing base, and more. It's a transition that may influence not just auto exposures, like Andy mentioned, also possibly property, liability, and cyber risk as well. So for the next 20 or so minutes, I'm going to do a high-level flyover of some of the ways that the transition to EVs may have an impact across different parts of our industry, different parts of our economy. Now, to be sure, this isn't going to be an overnight transition. Recent US EV sales do appear to be stalling a bit, and you're going to have to forgive me, there will be some bad automotive puns sprinkled throughout this presentation. But year over year, EV sales are growing at a rate of around 10%, but that's down from 50% prior to 2022. Now, that's according to Kelley Blue Book. That said, in the third quarter of this year, EV sales set a quarterly record of over 360 vehicles. That represents around 9% of all vehicles sold. That's according to Cox Automotive. Now, how high could this penetration grow? How rapidly? We have a forecast from Bloomberg NEF that suggests that close to a third of all new vehicle sales in the US could be EVs by the year 2027. What is significant about 2027? That is when the EPA's new vehicle emissions rules are generally beginning to be phased in. They get phased in at model year 2027. They're expected to be fully in place by model year 2032. Now, these emission rules, it should be said, they aren't necessarily EV mandates. There's no requirement that a vehicle have to have a battery. It's just that battery electric vehicles, some hybrid electric vehicles as well, really the only technology at hand today that's generally capable of meeting those emission requirements. But if there is a new technology that does enter the market, like hydrogen fuel cells, for example, that's capable of fulfilling the EPA's emission requirements, it's possible we could see vehicles supporting that technology as well. This is something that might be a little bit more relevant when we talk about heavier vehicles in a bit. The other factor that may be driving EV sales are federal tax credits that can be worth up to $7,500 for select EV purchases. So next year, a large number of used EVs are expected to qualify for at least some of those tax breaks. Analysts think that might help drive an acceleration in used electric vehicle sales. This is a good time as any to mention that, to the extent that federal programs, federal regulations may be propelling EV growth, that obviously might look very different in January, depending on what happens in our election. So it's a different story slightly when it comes to heavier vehicles. These are generally taking a lot longer to electrify than their light duty counterparts. You can see here, just a small fraction of registered trucks in the US are electric. There is stronger growth in certain heavy duty vehicle categories, things like buses. Those are electrifying a bit faster. There are also EPA emissions regulations in place for medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. They also start getting phased in model year 2027. Again, like their light duty counterpart, they're technology agnostic. So it's possible we could see other fuel types emerge to meet those emissions demands as well. It could be hydrogen fuel cells, for example. Some analysts think that those are actually better suited to the demand of this type of vehicle. Now, alongside the growth in electric vehicles, we obviously have growth in the infrastructure to fuel them, and that is charging stations. So you can see here, the US currently has over 100,000 public or private charging ports. White House has set a goal of 500,000 charging ports by the year 2030. Now, there had been questions, I think particularly at the end of 2022 into 2023, about whether the growth rate in this infrastructure would be sufficient to keep pace with the growth in electric vehicle sales. But like I mentioned, growth has slowed a bit, so it is possible that these two things can level out. We do have a more immediate concern with charging stations, though, and that revolves around crime. There appears to be a rash of thefts, particularly this year, targeting charging stations in places like Seattle, with thieves reportedly looking for the copper wire that might be inside charging cables. Apparently, these cables don't contain much in the way of copper, but replacing them can reportedly cost the station owner about $1,000 a pop. And then, of course, there's the downtime on the station, which could impact the owner and operator of that, as well as anyone hoping for a recharge. Now, as this charging infrastructure build out might suggest, the transition to EVs may lead to some significant job growth across different sectors of the US economy. That's both in the form of entirely new business categories, so things like EV battery recycling, alongside the growth in existing jobs. And I mentioned at the start how this is a transition that could potentially have a very broad impact, maybe across multiple lines of insurance. And I think that this is a good example. So our recent ISO general liability filing, for example, captured some of that new activity in a series of new classifications. So what you're seeing here are employment forecasts from the Bureau of Labor Statistics around some of the job categories that they're estimating will benefit or could benefit from the transition to electric vehicles. Now, of course, the growth isn't driven solely by EVs, but the BLS does see them getting a boost as part of the overall transition. But it is not all good. So the BLS is also forecasting some declines in some categories that may today help maintain internal combustion engines. And as you can see, the Congressional Research Service study here, this is from 2019, but they were forecasting at least a potentially significant job loss in parts of the automotive industry. This is in part because EVs have fewer moving parts, fewer things to build, possibly fewer things to maintain. So I want to talk a bit about some of the emerging risks around electric vehicles. And obviously, first place to start is with battery fires or thermal runaway. This is obviously a concern here. Certainly, I think it's safe to say in the public or media's perception of electric vehicles. Now, I think we might all be familiar with some of the challenges of EV fires. Just to review them quickly, when a battery enters thermal runaway, it can burn significantly hotter than an internal combustion engine. It can require a lot more water to extinguish, which means it could take longer to actually put that fire out. There is a risk if there's energy still left in the battery after the fire has been extinguished, there is a risk that that energy could trigger a new thermal runaway. So you have an ignition risk, and that risk can either be for hours after the fire's been extinguished or even days, even weeks after it has been extinguished. But it does continue to be the case, at least according to public data sources, that EV fires do not appear to happen more frequently than internal combustion engine fires. My colleague Raul from our personal lines actuarial team will have a bit more on what Verisk data is showing here later on. But this is a trend not just for US EVs, but also EVs sold internationally, at least where public data is concerned. If you can see here, if you look hard enough, both South Korea and Switzerland reporting lower rates of EV fires compared to battery electric vehicles. But I want to zoom in here for a moment on a specific angle with the EV fire question, and that is the potential for these vehicles to ignite during charging. So according to one analysis, about 20% of all EV fires globally have been linked to charging. Either they ignite during the charging session or within about an hour following that session. So this may pose a concern for any nearby property because, as I mentioned, these fires can burn very hot. They can take a very long time to put out. The other related issue here is that cars and homes and a lot of home furnishings in general have just become more flammable over time. That's because the materials that are used inside vehicles, used inside a lot of home furnishings, include plastics derived from fossil fuels, which are highly flammable. Other synthetic materials are also highly flammable. So you can see here the words of the US Fire Administration: fire is fast and getting faster. And EV battery fires, even if they may be a low frequency event, could at least potentially contribute to severity here, given how flammable everything may be around them. Then there's so-called right to charge legislation in several states. These are laws that generally stipulate charging station requirements for buildings, either new construction or existing construction. Could be another factor that is not only accelerating the build out of charging station infrastructure, but also determining where and how close that infrastructure may be placed to adjacent property. And then there is cyber risk. So if any of you on this webinar had the opportunity last month, or I'm sorry, in September, we did a deep dive into a lot of cybersecurity concerns, including some cyber concerns related to our vehicle ecosystem. I definitely encourage you to check out our website for that, because there's a lot of very valuable information there. I'm not going to go into great depths on the cyber concern here, but to note that, at least according to one automotive cybersecurity research firm, since 2010, there has been a 344% increase of cyber attacks against vehicles. Now that's all modern vehicles, any connected vehicle. So in this basic respect, the cyber vulnerabilities of an electric vehicle may not be all that much different than your traditional vehicle, even if some modern EVs do seem to have more sophisticated software control, which may in turn just be another vector for cyber attack. But there is a very important distinction here, and that is the charging stations. So charging stations can act, at least potentially, as another vector that spreads malware to an EV. They're not just necessarily passing electrons to cars, there can also be a data transfer as well. And I think this schematic can help illustrate this a bit more. So everywhere where you see a communication flow, and that's that orange or reddish dotted line, anywhere where you see that communications flow, you can, in principle at least, see a potential for malware to move across the ecosystem as well. So you can see, if you compromise one aspect of the EV ecosystem with malware, you do have the risk, at least potentially, that it might progress throughout the rest of that ecosystem, even up to and including electrical utilities. So a very, at least potentially, broad risk there. But sticking with the charging stations themselves for a moment, they are at least potentially a cyber vulnerability in their own right, because charging stations can be hacked. And charging stations can collect very sensitive customer data that can include personally identifiable information, billing information, the location information of drivers. So all of that data that these stations may collect could in turn be vulnerable to a hack, at least in theory. Another consideration we have with EVs is their weight. Now, it should be said, the entire US vehicle fleet has been getting heavier over time. We love large trucks, large SUVs, and according to the Environmental Protection Agency, since 1981, between 1981 and 2004, the average weight of vehicles on US roads has ballooned by around 28%. But electric vehicles can be significantly heavier than their equivalent gas-powered model, thanks to batteries and their protective housing. Now, there are a few consequences of this extra weight on vehicle safety, but what we're looking at here specifically is for the potential impact on infrastructure. So there was a study earlier this year by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and they tested the impact of electric vehicles against commonly used highway guardrails and traffic barriers. Now, these are the structures that help stop vehicles from leaving the road during a crash, or leaving the road if the driver loses control of a vehicle. Now, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, about half of all the traffic fatalities in the US in any given year involve crashes where vehicles leave the roadway. And that's about 19,000 deaths in the year 2023 alone. So this infrastructure, guardrails and traffic barriers, can have a very significant role in traffic fatality risk. So what the Nebraska researchers found was that when they collided heavier EVs with this infrastructure, the vehicle occupants were likely to survive just fine, but the barrier itself suffered catastrophic damage, and that included large pieces of concrete and steel that went airborne, that went flying, which obviously could pose a potential risk to people or property that are behind those barriers. And additionally, they found that large segments of these barriers were displaced by more than 50% beyond what that displacement would look like if there was a collision involving an internal combustion engine car. So a very significant infrastructure risk, at least in principle, as more electric vehicles hit the road. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the transition to electric vehicles may have a far-reaching impact, and nowhere, I think, is this more clearly seen than in the supply chain and industrial base. And there are a lot of issues that we can highlight with the EV supply chain, including possible ESG concerns involving forced labor along some of the mineral supply chains for EV batteries. There is also the US effort to shift our supply chains either to businesses operating inside the United States or in allied nations. And that includes everything from raw material extraction, so more mining potentially in the US, to vehicle and battery production done inside the US, as well as end-of-life battery recycling. But what I want to highlight here for now is how tight this supply chain might become, because when I'm talking about the supply chain here, what I'm really talking about is the potential for inflation, future inflation. And that's because, and I think COVID really helped to drive this home, but supply chain disruptions can exercise an inflationary influence across the economy. Supply goes up, or supply gets very tight, or demand spikes sharply, you could see prices go up. Pretty simple dynamic. So back to EVs, there are plenty of forecasts, particularly across the raw materials end of the EV supply chain. There are a lot of forecasts suggesting that we could be in for some very sharp demand growth. So according to the White House, EVs use around 6 times more minerals than your conventional car. And the White House is estimating that demands for critical minerals used in not just the batteries, but different components, semiconductors, for example. Critical mineral demand is expected to grow anywhere between 400, maybe up to 600% in some cases. And specific minerals that are associated with the batteries themselves, think of lithium or graphite, those may surge as much as 4,000% in the coming years. Now, it should be said, some of these forecasts were made at a time when US EV sales were growing at a much faster pace than they are now. But demand for these minerals is also global, so it's not necessarily just US EV demand that could influence the supply chain here. It could be demand growth coming from China, coming from the European Union. Those could all contribute to supply chain pressures here. So we do have at least forecasted demand that is expected to grow sharply. But another characteristic of the current EV mineral supply chain is not simply how much demand there may be, but how concentrated it is. So for example, an estimated 90% of the graphite that is used in EV batteries is refined in China. So again, I think what COVID drove home here is that when you have these concentrated supply chains, they may be vulnerable to disruption, and that could be disruption from a natural disaster, could be a geopolitical standoff. But whatever the case, that disruption may ultimately manifest itself in price pressures, higher costs to repair, replace EV parts, potentially longer waiting times. Now, some of this could be alleviated with an increased capacity for battery recycling. So more than 1 million EVs and hybrid batteries are projected to reach the end of their life by the year 2030. And that's a number that's projected to grow fairly significantly. So by as much as 14 million batteries should be end of life by 2040, maybe upwards of 50 million by 2050. Now, I mentioned one part of the US effort to build more of the battery supply chain in the US involves investment in battery recycling. And at least for now, it does appear that we may have enough recycling infrastructure in place to capture end-of-life batteries, at least for 2030. So, for example, there are some estimates that suggest that while we may have the capacity to repurpose around 1 million EV batteries by the year 2030, we may only be contending with about 1/3 of that amount that actually hits end-of-life recycling. So we could have more of a circular economy when it comes to EV batteries. So what I want to do now with the time I have left is just touch quickly on a couple of the emerging use cases that we see with EV batteries, as well as a quick look at some of the future technologies that we may see shaping the EV market. So let's start with bidirectional charging. Now, there is a lot of power in an EV battery. It's one of the reasons why those fires burn so hot and are so difficult to put out, all the energy that is packed inside of them. In fact, by some estimates, there's enough power in an EV battery pack to power the average American home for about 3 days. And there's a relatively new capability of these vehicles called bidirectional charging that looks to harness this power in a few different ways. So basically, bidirectional charging turns your electric vehicle into a portable power plant. It comes in a few different varieties that you can see here. There's V2H, that's vehicle to home. It enables you to use your EV like a backup generator if your power goes out. There's V2L, that's vehicle to load. It enables you to power a single appliance like a refrigerator from your EV. There's vehicle to grid, that's V2G, that enables you to send power from your car or truck through a charging station back up to the electrical grid. And if your vehicle can do all of the above, that's V2X or vehicle to everything. So several EVs support bidirectionality now, and more automakers have committed to incorporating bidirectionality into future models. There are currently several trials ongoing throughout the US that involve both residential and commercial applications of vehicle to grid, V2G, where homeowners, business owners are basically selling their EV power back to an electrical utility. We also do have some legislative efforts looking to drive this functionality as well. At the federal level in 2023, there was a bill introduced in the House of Representatives called the Bidirectional Electric Vehicle Charging Act of 2023, H.R. 6178, that would generally require the Secretary of Energy to develop a plan to help spur the development of this capability. California also recently enacted a bill generally looking at studying the impact of bidirectionality on the EV market as well as California electricity production. So still very early days with this capability. We don't have much data yet on how this functionality might influence EV risk at all. There are, though, obviously a few things that we're looking at. Fire of big concern. I mentioned about 20% of all EV fires were linked to charging a battery, but we don't really necessarily know the fire risks inherent in discharging one, which is what you would be doing in a bidirectional session. I think we do know, empirically and from our own life experience, that constant cycles of charging and discharging a lithium-ion battery can run that battery down faster. You see this with your smartphone and your laptops that can't seem to hold a charge over time. So it is possible, at least in principle, that vehicles engaged in bidirectional charging may experience battery failures more frequently due to the constant charging and discharging of their batteries. But I do really want to emphasize, we don't know yet what that looks like in practice. That's speculative. Another concern, cyber risk that we talked about, EVs and their charging stations are both possible vectors for malware, and bidirectional charging could open up the door to passing that malware more easily between home networks and maybe even the grid. So I just want to conclude here very briefly with a look at some possible future innovations in the EV space. And a lot of this, I think, at least what I'll touch on here, is going to be driven by batteries. Consumers, they tell pollsters that they're concerned about how far their EV can go and whether they'll have a charge along the way. And obviously there is that concern with battery fires. So one possible near-term innovation we are hearing a lot more about are solid state EV batteries. So in fact, there was just a major headline over the weekend about a major Japanese automaker that is expected to begin production on solid state EV batteries in 2026. So fewer than 2 years from now. Now, solid state batteries do promise a few things, including better range. There have been published reports that future EVs will get about 750 miles per charge thanks to solid state technology. These batteries are also expected to be smaller, so they won't take up as much room. They may result in lighter electric vehicles. They're also expected to charge faster and have a more stable chemistry, so potentially, at least there's hope, that solid state batteries less prone to thermal runaway. So that is it. We have a lot more on EV innovation and possible future technologies on our website, which Andy will point you to at the end of this. But my time is up, and it's my great pleasure now to introduce Raul Retian from our Personal Lines Actuarial Department, who's going to talk a bit more about what we have seen in the ISO data. Raul?
All right, thank you, Greg. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So we have a lot to cover, not a lot of time. So just quickly, Greg shared some information about the size of the market. Sorry, just taking a second to get the slides going. Thank you. So Greg shared some information about the growth of the marketplace, but by far, the ICE vehicles are still predominantly what's on the road. So I'm going to share some of the Verisk data here with you, and just want to set expectations about what percent of the data is EVs. And we typically like to look at the latest 5 years for this type of analysis, and it's about 3.4%. I'm citing hybrid information and sharing some of that on these slides, but the focus of this presentation is EV, so I won't say too much about them. But then also, I do just want to point out that, and this is going to grow in time. So if you're just looking at the latest year, the EVs are 8.4%. So as we build up more data, we'll be able to provide more solid insights and be able to get a little more granular as well. Okay, now I'm just going to go through some slides by coverage, give a quick orientation on what we're showing here, starting with bodily injury and property damage liability coverage. On the left, we'll have frequency. On the right, we'll have severity. And then we're breaking it out by all vehicles and splitting them out into gas, electric, or hybrid. As you'll see on virtually all these, because of the percent of ICE vehicles in the data, the two lines for gas and all vehicles are going to be similar. And I'll focus on the electric and how it's behaving compared to the rest. And I'll try to provide some insights that I think of what might be driving it, and not hard facts, not going to be true in every single case, but just some plausible explanations for what we're seeing. For liability coverage on the frequency side, I think in general, we've seen over time newer models having more and more ADAS features, more safety associated with them. It's been helping to bring down liability frequency, and we think that that's probably contributing here, that the electrics tend to have a lot more of these features. At the same time, some we're going to be looking into a little bit is, maybe there's possibly a hidden kind of class variable there, something that, the type of person that's choosing an electric, it says something more about their riskiness as a driver relative to the rest of the population. So some we're definitely going to be trying to dig into some more. On the severity side, as Greg talked about, these are heavier, and I think they're causing more damage, more harm when accidents are happening. So we see a little bit of a growth there, higher than the gas vehicles. Switching over to medical payments and no faults, and now we're talking about the first party coverage within the vehicle. Here we're seeing this frequency story is kind of the same there, but on the severity side, we kind of see the reverse effect, where perhaps the folks are a little bit safer in the heavier EV car. They're not getting banged around as much or displaced as much when in the accident. So a little bit of the opposite effect of what we just saw there. Now switching over to collision coverage, where I talked about that the accidents themselves from first dollar for liability seem to be improving. I think a phenomenon that we might be seeing when we try to look at the relative frequencies here, see the electrics are higher. I think part of it is, as we're thinking about the cost of repairing them, that even the smaller incidents tend to do some damage to some costly sensors, and that I think what we're probably seeing here is that, it's maybe really just the absence of some of the other small claims in the non-electric cars that don't make it into actually file a claim, but in electrics, probably there's a higher percentage of accidents that actually happen that make it to a claim level. And then on the severity side, certainly they are a little more expensive to fix, some of the issues that Greg brought up. But one thing I wanted to dig into here, and I have another slide, but before I switch over to that, probably the most common question that I get all the time is, these EVs, they're costing a lot to fix. Like what is Verisk, what is ISO doing to handle that in our rating plan, or are we covered? And I try to explain to them that, the way we have our vehicle symbol program, there as a starting point, the price of the vehicle is factored into selecting the symbol and the associated factor, and then any experience that the vehicles have over time, we try to adjust to that and try to get an even better answer there. So it's our program is meant to handle all types of vehicles and get the right answer, and EVs are kind of no different. But certainly we're going to monitor if anything special needs to happen for that pricing. But for now, I think hopefully you can take some comfort in this next slide that I'll show you. Here, the frequency side is the same, but on the severity side, what I have is an adjusted severity, where we basically just remove the symbol rating factor that our plan would have, just divide it out from the losses to kind of adjust for like how much additional premium our plan would suggest to be charged. You can see that now they're they're not so different from the others, and in fact, maybe they're even a little less. With this, I mentioned this is a really rough adjustment. I took it all out of severity, but certainly if vehicles are having better experience or worse experience, that all plays in. It could be a frequency effect, but this is just meant to be a kind of quick adjustment to account for the fact that, yeah, the EVs, maybe they're having some more costly collision claims, but in theory, there should be some more premium supporting those larger claims as well. I have slides here for comprehensive, but comprehensive is pretty difficult coverage to analyze given the nature of all the various types of claims they can cover, and wind and water and weather events playing into it. But in the interest of time, I'll kind of skip past. We see a lot of the same sort of patterns that we saw in other places here. And again, on the adjusted severity, it actually brought the EVs down quite a bit. But maybe combined, when you look at frequency and severity, they're kind of similar to their ICE counterparts. Now, that's the base slides I want to show you. And then there was one more thing I did want to show you about an investigation that we did. There's the point that Greg made about flooding and salt water getting into batteries, and that potentially leading to more fire claims. So we wanted to isolate a big instance of that by looking at Hurricane Ian and grabbing some states that were impacted heavily by that storm. And you can see on the top, we have just the wind and water from, other than collision or comprehensive losses, and the frequency that we had there. This is a paid loss exhibit. So Ian happened in September of 2022, but we see that a lot of the claims were paid shortly after that in fourth quarter of 22. So you see all three types, EV, hybrid, and other, are kind of moving pretty closely together there. But then we wanted to see if we could tease out a difference looking at fire, which we have below. And there you can see the dark blue line represents, it's generally a little bit higher, represents the ICE frequencies that you would see for fire. Whereas if you want to see the EV, that's the lighter blue line, not the teal one that's below. And you can see that over time, they're generally have much less fire frequency, but you can see that there is a spike. It's delayed. There's about a 2-quarter lag in the claims that we're seeing there that we believe is resulting from post-Ian claims that are happening, where maybe it takes a little time for the salt water to get in there and do its thing and cause the fire exposure to really pick up. But certainly it seems like there's some support here, some we should watch out for. And I would say, just personally, I can share that I thought it was interesting. I have a home in the St. Pete area, and we were just hit by Milton. Don't worry about me, we're fine. My vehicle's, my family's fine, our home's fine. But it was the first time I had seen, like, in all the news that I was watching and getting prepared for the storm, where they were really telling folks, like, hey, get your electric vehicles out of the flooding areas. There's a lot of flood prone areas, get them out of there. So I'm kind of interested to see when we have that data, to see if hopefully that had a positive influence, a society influence, and a lot of folks were able to protect their vehicles a little bit better and kind of avoid some of those nasty total fire claims. So that's all I have. I'm gonna pass it along to Sandy.
Thank you, Raul. And I always get intrigued by listening to what we're seeing in our data. I think even over the last few years, we continue to look at it and update it, and we're seeing it evolve. So as we've heard through this presentation about the risks and exposures, it's obviously still, relatively new compared to the many, many years of gas-powered vehicles being around. So we're still learning and we're still evolving, and I think that's going to continue. So on that note, as we do think about how we're learning and evolving, we are looking very closely and continue to look very closely at our auto programs, but not just our auto programs. I would say, besides looking at personal auto, commercial auto, we are looking at the impacts across, other areas as well, how these implications will affect homeowners insurance, how they will affect general liability, commercial property. So while we're focusing here today mostly on auto, we are working very closely across our lines of business to see the overall impacts that EVs and automation overall can have on our coverages. So, as we continue to look in that way, some of the things we've been honing in on specifically are, thinking about the fire considerations. These continue to be the top focus we do hear about from our customers and how fire affects personal auto. I would say this predominantly comes into play with what we're looking at from a rating standpoint, but we are being thoughtful about the overall implications on our coverages. So, we heard examples of, you got to think about where your vehicle's parked, particularly after flooding. As we get into bidirectional charging, is the vehicle plugged in? Where, when there is a fire, where is this coverage going to be attributed to? Is it going to come under, auto insurance if there's bidirectional charging? And is it going to be evident that, if the vehicle's doing the charging or if the vehicle's being charged from the home, where does the risk sit? So there are many things to consider, and this is something that we're really diving into on our end to make sure we, do look at that risk and make sure it's controlled and not impacting insurers in a double whammy. We also know that, cars are computers on wheels. They have been even before EVs came about. But, we're continuing to look at the cyber considerations and how being connected to whether charging at home or to public charging stations, the likelihood of viruses, how we have to think about cyber exposures within auto insurance. I've been in this business for well over 25 years now, and I will say, if you ask me when I started many years ago, I would not have expected to really been thinking about computers and cyber considerations for cars. So it's been a lot of evolution and changing. We also have to think about, a lot of electric vehicles are more automated. They are newer vehicles, so they have advanced safety features. So with advanced automation and technology, this does change how we look at liability. We're seeing more shift towards self-driven vehicles. We're not quite there yet, but as we get into, we're merging into the level 3 vehicles being on the road, and I know there's many test cases for fully autonomous, but as we see those shifts, we have to think about the liability considerations and where the liability is going to sit. So this continues to be top of mind for us. And then I will also say, there's other considerations we have to think about. We talked about the supply chain challenges earlier, repair time for these vehicles, how long is somebody renting a vehicle? And in our programs, we have certain transportation expenses or loss of use coverage, and these all may be impacted as we, continue to go down the path of the technology, the batteries, everything changing pretty rapidly compared to years ago and what that looks like. So just going into some of the other things we're thinking about, we've talked a little bit about potential for cyber considerations. I know Greg focused on, what we've already been seeing with some of these charging stations and the potential for hacking, for malware. So as we look at these, we continue to think about how these rapid advancements in electric vehicles, how these changes, the connections to cyber, the connections both internally in your home, externally at public stations, how they're going to affect what we're doing. We also are evaluating how these vehicles, with being more automated, how they are, I would say, updated. We know vehicles can have software pushes now. Years ago, if you wanted to customize your vehicle, they were all, they weren't software updates. They were material things, adding stuff onto your vehicles, pickup trucks be enhanced. But now we have to think differently about how these vehicles are modernized. And how expensive those customizations may be that are being pushed through software relative to the cost of the vehicle and potentially to the vehicle symbol. So just to round up here, as I mentioned, we are looking very closely at what updates to be made under the personal auto program. We are working on an update to ISO's program. We're likely looking at a 2025 filing, in addition to other changes that we are working on, but specifically focused on EVs. We are looking at changes to our Part D physical damage coverage to reflect some of these some of the evolution we're seeing around post-build upgrades, whether physical, software, the interaction between electronic equipment and traditional custom equipment, and how to streamline that to make it more feasible for insurers to potentially get underwrite these vehicles for the appropriate rate that they should be written at, but also capturing if there's a need to capture enhanced updates, upgrades to the vehicles that happen. We are also planning to introduce an auto hacking coverage endorsement that will be an optional multi-state endorsement, address exposures like diagnosing, restoring, repairing an auto after an auto hacking attack, including ransom payments. And then we're also looking at, I mentioned some of the supply chain concerns. We are working on changes for transportation expenses to reflect different needs in the market. So these are all going to be coming out soon. Filing, we're looking at 2025, and our customers can stay tuned for seeing more on the latest and greatest around that. And now I'm going to hand off to Andrea for our commercial auto discussion. Oh, sorry, I just skip that slide.
Thank you, Sandy. So you've heard a nice overview of all the electronic vehicle issues and trends we are monitoring. And today I'm going to spend some time talking about the emerging issues of electric vehicles on the commercial auto side. Next slide, please. So there's been a lot of legislative and regulatory activity surrounding electric vehicles. I'm going to highlight a couple of those in the slide pertaining to commercial auto. There is the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which requires states to make plans to build public charging stations every 50 miles. There's also the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes investment for the commercial auto industry with significant tax credit incentives to help cover the cost difference between a diesel and electric truck. And on the state level, California has the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation for commercial trucking, which requires that all trucking companies with 50 or more vehicles or $50 million in gross annual revenue replace their fleets with electric trucks by 2025. This not only applies to California, but also applies to out-of-state companies that meet these requirements and operate in the state of California at least one day per year. The commercial auto industry has its own unique challenges compared to personal auto with respect to the charging network development. Since commercial electric vehicles operate on schedules with daily business hours, charging hours can be limited compared to the charging opportunities that are available for personal use electric vehicles. Factors such as location of public charging stations, types of commercial vehicles, battery range consideration, fleet operation schedule demands, and the stability of the grid will all have to be weighed as public charging infrastructure for heavy-duty vehicles is considered. Despite the challenges of charging infrastructure, there is significant investment in electric vehicle fleets. According to one study, 1 in 5 new trucks worldwide could be purely electric as early as 2030, and by 2040, the share could be 90%. In supporting that projection, it's been reported that electric truck deployments by U.S. companies grew 5 times in 2023, with a recorded 10,265 electric trucks on the road. Breaking that down a bit more, in a matter of 4 years, there were reports of only 80 recorded electric trucks being deployed in 2020 to a staggering increase of over 10,000 by 2023. Next slide, please. As previously discussed, battery weight is a concern for all electric vehicles, but it is especially magnified with larger commercial vehicles. Larger electric vehicles with extended ranges do require larger batteries, and with the increased weight, there are potential safety concerns. While reportedly electric vehicles' lower center of gravity makes them less likely to roll over, one study suggests that the lower concentrated large truck mass of electric vehicles compared to other taller vehicles like pickups or SUVs could be to blame for decreased guardrail effectiveness. In addition to safety concerns, the increased battery weight may reduce the number of goods that electric vehicles can transport, which could increase the amount of trucks needed and can lead to potential higher rates due to the increase in operational costs. Currently, federal regulations grant electric vehicles an additional 2,000-pound weight limit allowance, which could help with the additional battery weight. However, one study estimates an electric vehicle semi-truck could be up to 5,000 pounds heavier than a diesel semi-truck. The auto transporter industry in particular is pushing lawmakers to increase the truck weight limit on U.S. highways, saying that under the current weight restriction, they can't move as many electric vehicles, which could delay fulfilling orders. However, there is opposition to this as safety experts say heavier vehicles are harder to stop and could result in more wear and tear on roads and bridges. Battery weight consideration could also impact insurance rating, as insurance companies use the gross vehicle weight rating of a vehicle as a key factor in determining insurance premiums and coverage limits. And as truck weight is higher with electric vehicles, they could have a higher weight classification under Rule 223 of the ISO Commercial Lines Manual, which is for trucks, trailers, and trailers classifications. The higher weight classification generally is higher premium, therefore resulting in potential higher operational costs and profitability concerns. Next slide, please. So moving on to battery fire concerns, commercial auto does not have data on the loss difference between electric and gas vehicles. However, private passenger type vehicles are commonly also written under the commercial auto program. And while the vehicles may be used differently, the information on personal auto loss experience for electric vehicles that was reported on earlier may also apply to commercial auto. However, there could be unique challenges for commercial auto and fire risk, such as fleets parked in proximity to each other or in parking lots, garages, vehicle auction lots, and collision repair facilities. Of particular concern is potential physical damage loss to buildings or other vehicles. Implementing a fire safety plan for damaged electric vehicles on commercial lots will be something that should be considered, such as adding fire suppression systems, having dedicated observation zones when electric vehicles monitored for a specific amount of time to ensure there are no fire risks before entering main repair facilities. Next slide, please. And then lastly, with the time I have left, I will just touch on some of the other concerns. As we heard earlier, electric vehicles with bidirectional charging capability is an emerging issue that we're also monitoring for commercial auto. The auto is potentially being used in a way that was not traditionally contemplated, and there may be questions regarding where coverage may apply. Some of the potential exposures we are looking at are fire risks, such as scenarios where fleets located in business lots are discharging to the grid, which could potentially heighten the risk of fire with a concentration of vehicles, as well as potential liability in the event of a system failure. If bidirectional charging is used as a backup generator to a building, home, or other vehicles and the system malfunctions, there could be liability of multiple parties, including the automaker or the manufacturer or installer of the charging system. Another concern with bidirectional charging is possible cyber attacks, where business or home systems or even the grid are at risk when a virus or malware is passed from charging stations to electric vehicles. This cyber concern is not limited to bidirectional charging, as cyber risks are of specific concern for the trucking industry. with respect to the use of electronic logging devices, which record data regarding driver hours of service and are a federal requirement for commercial drivers that are required to keep records. A report published by researchers at the Colorado State University recently revealed a potential security vulnerabilities in electronic logging devices that can enable attackers to exploit network features and inject self-replicating worm malware capable of disrupting an operator's abilities to log information and could stop the functionality of the truck. These attacks reportedly can be carried out via Bluetooth or over Wi-Fi at truck stops, ports, or rest stops. And then lastly, the industry is facing a shortage of repair shops that have all the necessary specialized equipment and with the vehicle lifts, especially for large, heavier electric vehicles. There's also challenges with a lack of mechanics trained in all the safety protocols for high voltage repairs. And all of these factors can drive up repair costs and increase downtime, as well as the amount paid out on claims and associated loss of use, transportation expenses, and business interruption. As the adoption of electric vehicle grows, it will be essential that the automotive repair industry evolves and expands to keep up with business demands. And on that note, I'll pass it back to Andy Blanchard.
Thank you, Andrea, and the rest of our speakers. So in the short remaining time we have a little bit of an interactive portion. It's a poll, and if you could all just grab your mice and help us here. The question is, of the emerging risks you've heard about today, which would you like to learn about more? First is cyber vulnerabilities of EVs and EV infrastructure. Second choice is the supply chain concerns surrounding the EV transition, how EV weight may impact US infrastructure, and last, how future EV technologies may influence automotive risks. I will give a few more seconds for the results to come in, and then we'll share them with you. All right, I think that's probably about enough time. If we can pull up the results slide. And there we go. It looks like what received the most votes at 47% is how future EV technologies may influence automotive risks. Appreciate that. That is absolutely where we're going to be focusing. And then coming in next, the cyber vulnerabilities of EVs and EV infrastructure, with the others pulling up third and fourth. I'm going to jump ahead now to our final slides. Thank you again for everybody who made a selection there. So if you'd like to learn more about this topic, we've got you covered at core.verus.com. Here you'll find a dedicated topic page on EVs. You can get some foundational knowledge on EVs, although you got a lot of that today, right? Research articles, and we're constantly scouring the web and curating our newsfeed. Let me tell you, that newsfeed, we do that daily. So we're always looking to keep that updated and fresh and keep our community informed. You can also read about some recent articles that we've published on EVs, some of which you've heard about today. On the horizon, beyond EVs, there's a world of emerging issues out there, right? It's not just EVs. We cover over 60 topics at core.verus.com. This is our bread and butter. Our work is contextualized and designed for the P&C community and professionals like yourself hearing my voice. And if you want to stay on the cutting edge of all these topics, there's a QR code there at the bottom. Get yourself signed up for our weekly newsletter. I promise you'll be glad that you did. Oops, jumped ahead too quick. And last, we have line of business hubs. We have a personal auto hub, a commercial auto hub, and more recently, we just rolled out our cyber hub. So please do check us out there. In the few seconds we have left, on behalf of Greg, Raul, Sandy, and Andrea, and the rest of the Emerging Issues team, I want to thank everyone for their time, for keeping us in their workflow, and for sharing the past hour with us. Again, we're going to put this presentation and the slides and the Q&A. We want to put that on our site soon, so keep an eye out for that. Happy Monday, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.